tale that, although shocking, has been heard all too often before. Caregivers who not only abuse their roles, but fail to live up to them too. A little girl left to fend for herself. A system and society that failed her. 2 years old with an entire future ahead of her. 2 years old and dependent on those whom she was supposed to trust. 2 years old and a life cut short. This is the heart-wrenching case of Chevonne Rusch. Hello and welcome to Murder and Mayhem, South African true crime, with me, your host, Bella Monsoon. I know, it's been a hot minute, but so much has been happening behind the scenes, like truly. So here's a super quick life update. Right, so first up, I kind of wrote, illustrated, and published an entire book. Murder and Mayhem, a truly criminal South African coloring experience, from design and illustration to composition and execution, have been created all by myself. And without giving too much away, it's unlike any other coloring book you've ever seen. I guarantee it. So for those of you who are interested and want to check it out, it is the perfect Christmas gift, even to yourself. It is now available for pre-order on my website. It'll be shipping from the 1st of December, and it will be available on Takealot within the next week or so. As many have requested with other products I sell in the past, this is actually something I can offer to my international subscribers. So if you are part of the international Valaboo family and would like to purchase, pop me an email or DM and I can discuss different shipping options available with you. And of course, I would not launch a new product without a giveaway. Duh. So the first giveaway is going to be for my South African audience. I will be hosting an international giveaway super soon, so keep an eye out for that. The first giveaway will be running not only on YouTube, but also on Instagram and TikTok. So if you want to triple your chances of entering, you can enter on multiple platforms. So if you want to win not only the first edition of my Murder and Mayhem adult coloring book, as well as a customized true crime pencil case and a pack of Stapler coloring pencils and some bits and bobs, as well as some true crime stickers that I designed myself, then here's what you need to do. Obviously be subscribed and part of the Valaboo family, and then all I need from you is why you think you deserve to win the South African True Crime Prize. The competition will run until the 15th of December, whereafter a winner will be chosen, posted online on all the different social media platforms, and you will receive your prize well before Christmas. Merry Christmas to you. And then on a completely separate note, because believe it or not, that is not all I've been up to, I also decided to open my very own practice. I've pretty much been busy finalizing all the small details, dotting the I's, crossing the T's. For now, my practice will be fully online, offering counseling and therapy sessions, not only to South Africa, but worldwide. For those of you who listened through all of this and are still here, thank you. You are the MVPs and you are the reason why all of this is possible. Without each and every single one of you, none of this would have even been a thing. So in case you're new and you decided to listen to my life update but have no idea who I am, then stay tuned. I'm about to explain it and break it down for you. If you are returning and you would like to skip ahead and skip the intro, here is a timestamp for you to do so. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm a registered mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with makeup, true crime, and understanding the motives that drive people to do what they do. What this means is that every single week I host a brand new video looking at a real life crime from a psychological viewpoint. My intimate knowledge and experience within the field led me to create the first South African trauma-informed true crime series. Every single week, when I haven't been taking the longest break ever, I post a brand new video looking at a real life crime from a psychological viewpoint. During these episodes, I also try to share psychological knowledge and concepts that you may or may not be aware of in an easy to understand format. So if all of that sounds like something that is right up your alley, then please do consider subscribing and joining the Valaboo family. But if you're more a fan of podcasts, it ain't no worry. I got you. You can find me from my sister podcast, Murder and Mayhem, South African True Crime, available on all major streaming channels. Just a quick disclaimer for today's episode. Today's narrative contains material citing the murder and abuse of a minor. As always, I mean absolutely no disrespect to the victim nor their family. The purpose of this video is to shed further light on the heinous crime that was committed while spreading awareness about the psychological nature of the narrative. This episode has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes, where available, real-life accounts, footage, and images of individuals involved directly in the case. So, without further delay, let's get into it. Our narrative today centers around a beautiful little girl who was brought into this world in 2019. But to truly understand her and her life, we need to understand a little bit more about the people who brought her into this world. Rochelle Botha grew up in Johannesburg and attended Primrose High School. Life was pretty normal for her growing up, and over the years that followed, she would engage in an on-again, off-again relationship with Bradley Rusch. Rochelle fell pregnant with Bradley's children in 2017, 2018, and 2019. Even though 3 children were born, though, only one was registered with the Department of Home Affairs. The first child would go and live with a relative when she was only 1.5 years old. Whilst she was there, Rochelle would give birth to her second child, but she would end up leaving Bradley for another man. In that time period, she wasn't really bothered with either of her children, which resulted in a relative whose identity was concealed by the court becoming the guardian of both children. Her fling with the new boyfriend was short-lived, and after a few weeks, they had broken up. At this point in time, Rochelle and her mother had called upon this relative to get her 2 children back. With her kids in tow, she then began dating Bradley again, and the two, with their children, had gone to live with another relative in Germiston. They also approached the court and successfully managed to set aside the court application that was set to place the children permanently in the care of the relative who had been looking after them for the past few months. In hindsight, an incredibly sad turn of events. Rochelle, despite the circumstances she was in and her inability to cope with the children she already had, fell pregnant once again in 2019. On the 28th of October 2019, Chevonne Rusch was brought into the world. Chevonne would later affectionately be known as Vonnie by her family members and was often described as the love of the family. She grew up loving music and dancing, and even at her young age was always acting silly and joking. So as I previously stated, at this point in time, Rochelle and Bradley were living together at another relative's home with their son as well as Chevonne. Both adults were unemployed at the time, with Bradley finding work here and there, working occasionally, and Rochelle never having worked a day in her life. So you may be wondering where the firstborn, her eldest daughter, was during all of this. Well, she had gone back to live with the original relative who had basically raised her. And this yo-yoing, moving back and forth, children coming and going, lasted for a few years. That was until Bradley was arrested in April of 2021. He ultimately would end up spending a year in prison. I won't go into any further details regarding that, as it has not very much to do with this current case in the sense of being involved directly in what would happen. During this period of time, whilst he was away, Chevonne and her brother were living with Rochelle and her family, and her eldest daughter, as I mentioned, was living with his family. Also, during this time, most importantly, around 2 months into his prison sentence, Rochelle would meet and begin to date Cornelius Stefan van die Kerk. She was only around 21 years old at the time. He, however, was older than her, in his 30s, and he was from Walkerville. And yeah, it was around this point where things started to decline rapidly. After an incredibly short period of time, I'm talking days and weeks, not months, the pair decided to move in together to a large cargo container. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, but they then decided to go and fetch Chevonne's brother, Rochelle's second-born, who was staying with Bradley's family at this point, and bring him to live with them. For some reason, they thought that this was a great idea. Around this point in time, Chevonne, as well as her older sister, the firstborn, were living with relatives, with Rochelle being able to see them on weekends. Although she was allowed allowed to see them every single weekend, she later requested an amendment to see them only every second weekend, as she stated that having all 3 children with her together over the weekend was just too much for her. Yeah, I kid you not. Then, by the 10th of July 2021, just a mere 3 months after Bradley exited the picture, the pair were engaged. It was consistently stated that when Stefan van die Kerk entered the picture, the abuse of the children began, with bruises being noticed and strange behaviors being developed. If you know much about childhood development, you will know that change in behavior that is incredibly drastic is usually an important signal that something untoward may be going on. Another witness in the later court case would state how she had met Chevonne in 2021 when she had visited friends who were relatives of Stefan. Despite the cold weather at the time, the little girl was in shorts and a short-sleeved shirt, barefoot, without a diaper or underwear. She also allegedly had a burnt and swollen upper lip and had apparently complained that her genital area and her legs were burning and sore. When the couple, Rochelle and Stefan, had been questioned, they had apparently said that Chevonne had just fallen. The witness had then made the decision to take this little girl home as she was in a terrible state. And yes, I know that is a risky thing to do, especially with the different legalities around children at play, but here's the kicker. After being informed of this, Rochelle had immediately agreed, without having even met the individual who had her child. Obviously, this woman had good intentions, but this is not necessarily the day and age to be trusting random strangers with your children. Later, Rochelle would claim that the couple was so busy and distraught looking for Stefan's brother who had gone missing that they weren't in the right frame of mind to even compute what was going on. And in case you were wondering, yes, Stefan's brother was allegedly missing and he was found too. Regardless, Chevonne continuously shouted for her mother that night, refused to bath, but eventually drank a bottle of milk and fell asleep in this woman's arms. The next day, this woman let her watch TV with her own toddler and gave her a pacifier and some yogurt. During this time, she would also take photos of the little girl's bruised face, sending them to Childline South Africa, who had promised to investigate the matter. Chevonne would end up spending 3 days with this woman. Eventually, unfortunately, but inevitably, she returned to Rochelle and Stefan. It didn't appear that much came of that complaint to Childline. Well, not that I could find anyways. It was only almost a year later, in February of 2022, when the policing forum in Germiston first heard about Rochelle and her children. This had come about after her family had contacted them, stating that Rochelle was being held against her will, tied up and mistreated by, of course, none other than Stefan. When an individual was sent over to the home, Rochelle had denied every single claim, stating that her family were making up stories in order to worm themselves into her relationship and life. She had even called the policing forum directly to arrange a visit, just days before Chevonne was murdered. During this visit, she had stated that Stefan was a good man who had never harmed her children. She had said, and I quote, "I can promise you that I will kill him before he kills me." At the visit, Rochelle had no obvious injuries to her body, and coincidentally, the children were not home at the time. The relative who had been looking after Chevonne's eldest daughter, who basically raised her, had complained to the police weeks before her death, and was unable to gain access to see both Chevonne and her brother. The four had basically disappeared. They had gone under the radar with no one knowing where they lived, and them dodging every single attempt to reunite Chevonne with her sibling. The last time the relative heard from Rochelle was at 2 a.m. on the morning of Chevonne's death, when Rochelle had texted her, "Oh, don't stress, it's fine." This was in response to an earlier message where Rochelle stated that she wanted to know something from the relative. The relative had then tried to phone her to have a telephonic conversation, however Rochelle had not answered. This same relative would later hear the heartbreaking news about Chevonne, and when she had questioned Rochelle over what had happened, Rochelle had simply stated, and I quote, "I am very sorry. After Chevonne's death, multiple versions of the events that transpired on the day would be shared by Rochelle herself. In one scenario, she was tied up and detained by Stefan before he eventually took the life of her daughter. In another one, Chevonne had apparently slipped on a sponge, falling and injuring herself. And all of these stories began to circulate before she was even a suspect in this case. So by now, I'm sure you're curious as to what happened to this beautiful little girl. And to be able to answer that question, I'm going to be including information that was only divulged in a way later court case. But I'm sharing it with you now because it makes more sense in a chronological order. On the 11th of May, 2022, the lifeless body of Chevonne was dropped off at the Wannenberg Clinic in Klopper Park, Germiston, where she was pronounced dead. The man who had dropped her off had sped away immediately afterwards. Upon inspection of her tiny body, several bruises were noted. The clinic personnel had then called Primrose police officers. When they arrived, the nurses showed them the child, Chevonne, who had been brought in by a man thought to be her stepfather. The little girl was wrapped in a blanket, with blood in her mouth and bruises all over her body. She also had a wound at the back of her head. The post-mortem examination, along with evidence provided by the pathologist during the trial that would later follow, confirmed that the 2-year-old suffered injuries from head to toe. There were a total of 49 bruises, abrasions, wounds, and scars on the tiny toddler's body. According to the pathologist, Dr. Imifa Apatu, most of the injuries were sustained within the span of a few hours to a day before her death, referred to as fresh wounds. The injuries were present on her face, scalp, arms, abdominal wall, lower back, legs, and feet. They believed that most likely the cause of death was from blunt force trauma to the head. And as though the news of her murder was not traumatic enough, especially for her father Bradley and her family, it would come to light that Chevonne's birth was never registered, so that had to be completed first before a death certificate could even be issued. And trust me on this one if you're not South African. Most of the time, admin in South Africa that involves the government in any type, way, or form is no easy nor quick feat to get done. And so, little Chevonne's body lay for almost a month before she was buried. At her funeral on the 2nd of June, it would be said, and I've translated this from Afrikaans, and I quote, "A child is a gift from God. The Lord gave us the special person to look after, not to destroy." At the funeral, Rochelle and Chevonne's father, Bradley, carried her small pink coffin into a chapel in Alberton. One of her favorite songs, Dance Monkey, played as her coffin was placed at the front of the church. Ironically, it would be said by the pastor that one should trust no one with their children, and that parents should look after their children because they were given to them. Ironic because Rochelle was going undetected amongst all the fellow mourners. At the end of the service, friends and family released pink balloons into the air to celebrate the little girl's life. Now, I'm sure you're still a little confused as to who, where, when, and what actually happened to Chevonne. Well, in this sordid narrative, the truth took a little while to come to the surface. But after the discovery of the bruises on the toddler's body, Stefan van die Kerk was apprehended in Bedford View shortly afterwards. It would only be the day after Chevonne's death when Rochelle would indicate that Stefan had abused at least one of her children. This would come after his arrest. After his initial court appearance, he sobbed whilst looking down, his face buried in his hands. He would appear again in court on the 25th of May, when he was expected to apply for bail. On the day, he arrived with a scarf covering most of his face, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. At this appearance, he also abandoned his bail application. At this very same appearance, Rochelle, although present, kept herself in the shadows, wearing a bulletproof vest and not engaging with angry protesters or members of the public. Rochelle was present at the court as protesters lambasted her, calling her a bad mother and saying that she was guilty too. She ended up having to leave the court proceedings. A family friend of hers, who identified herself on the day as Kayla, would later state to media, and I quote, "The drama outside was unnecessary, and Rochelle was unable to attend the bail hearing, with the crowd making it difficult for her to mourn her child's death." Oh, the irony of that statement and situation. And as I alluded to earlier, the truth slowly but incredibly surely seeped to the surface. Just a few weeks later, a whole lot would change, as Rochelle was arrested and charged with murder on the 22nd of August. Yep. You heard me correctly. This came about after external investigations into the case uncovered further information about the home and living conditions of Chevonne and her siblings. It also came to light that Rochelle was well aware of the alleged abuse and assault of her own child. The news of Rochelle's arrest was a further blow and a shock to Bradley, who vehemently believed, as most do, that parents are supposed to protect their children. Bradley said his daughter died whilst he had been trying to get her back for more than a month. Came about after she had gone to visit her mother, Rochelle, for what was supposed to be just a weekend visit. He had said, and I quote, "I think my daughter's death could have been avoided because she died while I was trying to get her back and was being taken from pillar to post." Rochelle's case was postponed to the 1st of September for her bail application, which carried over to the following week. During her court appearance, she was also told by the judge to change her clothing for future appearances, as it was inappropriate for her to show up to the court in extremely short, tight training shorts. At this point in time, the pair were facing not only charges of assault with the intent to injure, but also charges of rape, sexual assault, and a charge of human trafficking. And as you can only imagine, the public were outraged, initially at the actions of Stefan, but now more so at the potential involvement of the child's own mother in her demise. A Facebook group, which had been started, A Voice for Chevonne, updated the general public on the court happenings and updates, gaining over 10,000 members within days of being created. Rochelle, on the other hand, turned to the comforts of an unknown male friend, as she remained in custody until her next court appearance. After the extended bail application and the back and forth, Rochelle ended up temporarily abandoning her bid altogether. Stefan, who had been in custody since May, was set to appear alongside her on November 9th in front of the High Court. And so much more would come to the surface during this court case. And after what felt like it had been a lifetime since the little girl had passed, although by South African standards it was fairly fast, shocker, the trial began in 2023. In another sad loss though, Chevonne's great-grandfather passed away just a week before her trial would begin. He had been there throughout the entire process, but he had deteriorated rapidly after learning about the toddler's passing. Devastated and more so shocked by the ever-changing turn of events. As more witnesses came forward and testified, including Rochelle's two children who were 6 and 7 years old at the time, the public and the investigative team learned about the stark and sordid reality of Chevonne and her siblings. Well, at least their life with Stefan and Rochelle, that is. Two vital witnesses in particular, who remained anonymous at the time due to a court order in place, shared the timeline of events that led up to the little girl's death. And so, I'm about to share that with you. These witnesses had spent the day prior with the couple, Rochelle and Stefan. One of the witnesses' family members would state how upon seeing the pair that day, they noticed that Chevonne had a wound on her lip. When asked about it though, the couple had simply stated that she had fallen down the stairs. This despite the fact that the wound resembled a burn, similar to the shape of a glass pipe that is used to smoke crystal meth. The witness was quite steadfast in this belief, as he often engaged in drug use with the couple with this very same kind of pipe. The little girl had also been in pain, barely speaking. Later testimony within the trial would also allude to the abuse of one of Rochelle's other children, the baby boy, who had bruises on his arms, face, and thighs. It would also come to light that a doctor had noted several injuries on his body, 13 in fact. Some were days old, whilst others had healed months prior. These types of injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma to the head or a physical fight. As the evening wore on and the inhabitants of the home smoked meth, the little girl had approached these two witnesses asking for food and water. She was then sent to Rochelle as the witnesses did not want to smoke in front of her, but Rochelle did not want the child around, complaining as much to Stefan. And so the night progressed. The following morning dawned and the group had gathered in the kitchen, smoking and eating. Then Stefan had taken the little girl to bath. She had been screaming non-stop, to a point where both witnesses had approached Rochelle to help the little girl. This came about after Stefan had argued that Chevonne was fine. The defense would later state that the only reason Chevonne was crying was because the water was cold. Rochelle, however, was apparently unbothered by her child's cries or their request for assistance and walked outside to go sit in the sun, paint her nails, and light a cigarette. The crying in the meantime continued until it suddenly went quiet. Stefan had then come running out of the bathroom, running to the bedroom and then the living room with the child in his arms, attempting to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Rochelle, barely bothered by the chaos that was ensuing in the house, had entered the home allegedly, observed the scene before returning back outside. One witness has then allegedly told Stefan to take the toddler to the hospital, picking her up and placing her in the vehicle. And her mother? Well, yeah, you guessed it. She refused to go along, opting to stay at the home with the other witness. The very same witness who would see absolutely no change in the facial expression of Rochelle when she was later told on a phone call that her 2-year-old little girl had died. At the time of her death, Chevonne had only been in the care of Rochelle and Stefan for 40 days. Prior to that, of course, she had been living with Bradley's family. During the trial that took place, multiple different versions of what had happened to Chevonne that day would be heard. 3, in fact. And yes, in case you were wondering, I'm going to share those with you now. The first version of events involved Stefan being incredibly grumpy that day, as he had lost his job and was thus taking out his frustration on the little girl, especially after she had apparently spilt some water. After he had yelled at her for spilling the water, she had apparently wet herself in fear. He had then taken her to bath, but Chevonne had kept crying for her mother. Rochelle, however, casually left out the part where she ignored her child's crying. Eventually, the shouting had stopped, and when Rochelle went to go and look and see what was going on, she came across the little girl, blue in the face. She then apparently attacked Stefan, in the process falling on the floor. And then at some point, Stefan had put the child into his vehicle and taken her to the hospital. Version number 2. In the second version, the one that was told to very many family members by Rochelle, Chevonne had apparently been in the bathroom when she had slipped on a sponge, fallen, and in the process she had hit her head. I'm assuming the story had ended with either Rochelle or Stefan finding her and subsequently Stefan rushing her to the hospital. And then of course we can't leave out version 3. In this last version of events, Rochelle had walked in on Stefan strangling the toddler. When she had tried to intervene, he had then apparently tied her to a plastic chair in the yard, leaving a friend of his to watch over her. When asked why she did not scream for help, she had no response. Also, on a side note, as the home had been searched after Stefan's arrest, the logs showed that there were no plastic chairs that had been found. Yeah, so that's that. Whilst Rochelle had multiple different stories though, Stefan, on the other hand, denied all the charges against him, constantly stating that he couldn't remember or didn't know when he was being questioned. He also went on to claim that he did not know about any of the wounds or bruises and marks on the child's body, and she had just simply fallen down the stairs. witnesses. And in case it was not bad enough, the indictment against Rochelle would also state that she allegedly allowed men to touch her children's private parts in exchange for access to drugs. The couple, together, also allegedly forced a child to smoke drugs. These charges all appeared within the charge sheets as well. At the trial, Rochelle would later give testimony, having to stop at one point due to being too emotional. When she was questioned about how she did not see the injuries all over Chevonne's tiny body, she had responded that she did not know. She responded this way to many of the questions that were asked. She was also unable to state why she didn't send images or videos of Chevonne as requested by the little girl's grandmother, or why she avoided allowing her back over to the relative's home. She also admitted on the stand that she used drugs, but apparently never in front of her children. She did, however, divulge that Chevonne had indeed burnt the little girl's mouth with the hot meth pipe, as suspected by the witness. At the end of her questioning, Rochelle had an emotional outburst, shouting, and I quote, "I didn't know." Next up on the stand was her ex-fiancé and partner in crime, Chevonne, who, as it was discovered, had a previous conviction for theft as well as a breached parole history, appeared calm as he testified on the stand. He denied Rochelle's claims that he had tied her up and stated that he had taken Chevonne to bath after she had soiled herself. As he had laid her in the bath, she had allegedly began to breathe funny. He had then apparently given her mouth to mouth, and a small amount of liquid had come out of her mouth, her little body twitching. He stated that the family had moved homes just a few days before her death, and Chevonne had fallen down the stairs of their old house. Neither adult had apparently either checked to see if she was injured after that fall, though. Chevonne would also admit to using drugs, smoking tuck and marijuana. To many of the questions that he was asked, like his lover, he had responded that he did not know or he could not remember. Chevonne would also admit to using drugs, smoking tuck and marijuana. When accused of physically abusing minors, he had insisted that hitting a child with his elbow was just a boxing game, and assaulting a minor because they broke a possession that belonged to his mother was completely validated. Yeah, I kid you not. Eventually, the trial drew to a close, and on the 17th of November 2023, the judge, Annaline Africa, reached a verdict. She stated that Rochelle failed to fulfill her duties as a parent. Both individuals were found guilty of abusing, neglecting, and murdering Chevonne, as well as guilty of with the involvement of another minor. In addition, there was also a guilty verdict in the lines of attempted murder, assault, and child abuse. The judge went on to state that the evidence indicated that the pair had lied during the trial in order to protect themselves. In the verdict that spanned 4 hours, a dark picture was painted of the heartbreaking conditions and experiences of Chevonne and her siblings, whilst with Rochelle. It was evident that Rochelle had a parental duty which she failed to do. The judge had said, and I quote, "Her actions were those of a selfish person who did not care about the well-being of the children." Rochelle began to cry when she heard the verdict, whereas Chevonne simply stared coldly ahead, unflinching and expressionless. Rochelle had then shouted at him, and I quote, "I hate you, Chevonne. Do you see now?" The friends, family, and supporters, although relieved at a conclusion to the trial, were understandably emotional and traumatized after the events of the past months. Bradley, Chevonne's father, had left the courtroom at times when details of the abuse Chevonne experienced were spoken about. And so, what happens now? The pair will appear in court again next year on the 2nd of February, when the pre-sentencing report will be heard. I'll be sure to update the description or to include a mini segment once the case is concluded. Oh, and in case you were wondering, Rochelle seems to be doing just fine in prison, as much as one can judge from the Facebook profile that was active up until a few months ago. She uploaded profile pictures with fellow inmates smiling. The comments on these photos are also positive, coming from friends and family. I mean, I think we all know by now that having phones in prison is clearly a thing. So, of course, without further delay, let's dive right into the mind behind the macabre. In my previous 2 episodes, I've discussed mothers who have taken the lives of their own children. I won't get too far into the cases now, but I will link them in the description if you are interested. The first, I'm sure many of you would have seen by now, was the narrative of Lauren Dickerson, who murdered her 3 young daughters. The second was of Ellen Pakis, who ended the life of her drug-addicted son. If you're interested, they both approach the psychological idea of murdering a child in 2 very different ways. These cases demonstrate the psychological concept known as filicide, the deliberate killing of one's own child. As I discussed in previous episodes, there are several routes for these horrific actions. This particular case, unlike the 2 previous ones, have roots in the murder being an accident, in the sense that the intent was to punish rather than kill. Rochelle was at best an absent mother, more interested in pursuing other men, drugs, and fun than looking after the children that she brought into this world. Many will also state that because she was such a young mother, it was almost to be expected. However, in 2023, there are so many young parents who are doing amazing jobs and focusing all the attention on their kids. So I'm not sure if we can still place that level of emphasis on age in this regard. It does, however, appear that she was not emotionally mature enough to be able to look after her children. Add to that an unhealthy relationship with an unstable man, as well as the use of drugs, and, well, it just kind of spells disaster. As she was younger, there is also the possibility that she was influenced and controlled by the very domineering nature of her partner. In one of my very early episodes, I think it was The Springs House of Horrors, I do showcase the concept of battered woman syndrome. However, I cannot go further into detail and assume that this was the case with Rochelle, as there is no evidence or testimony that she was the recipient of emotional, physical, or sexual abuse at the hands of Stefan. It is just something to keep in mind when regarding these kinds of cases. Although some of the relatives of Chevonne also try to step in multiple times, there is only so much that can be done in legal terms, at least. At the end of the day, Rochelle was still the legal guardian of the children, and thus somehow consistently was able to maintain custody of them, regardless of the fact that she was an unfit mother. And one just really needs to question the governing bodies and organizations in this regard if these reports were in fact actually made. And if there were no further actions taken to report this situation to higher authorities, one must also consider why this was the case. What comes to mind with this case in particular for me are the striking similarities between Chevonne and Poppy van der Merwe. I covered her case of neglect and ultimate death a year or 2 ago. Like Chevonne, Poppy was also neglected and physically abused by her mother's partner whilst her mother stood idly by. Like Chevonne, Poppy was rushed unresponsive and declared dead on arrival at the hospital. Like Chevonne, Poppy's little body was covered in bruises. And like Chevonne, both of Poppy's caregivers were ultimately arrested, charged, and convicted for her murder. A psychological phenomenon which I discussed in that episode may also be pertinent here too. The phenomenon, known as the bystander effect or bystander apathy, is a social psychology theory that states individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim in distress when there are other people present. In the case of Poppy, although teachers, doctors, and neighbors noticed what was happening, only one of them reported it. In the case of Chevonne, potentially more relatives and friends than the ones that did try to intervene could see something was not right, but did nothing. And unfortunately, by the time anyone tried to intervene, it was too little, too late. It is also pertinent to note here that it is actually illegal to be aware of child abuse or maltreatment and not report it. Just a little something to keep in mind. But it's not fair to only just point the finger at everyone else. When the perpetrator, Stefan, felt confident to behave in the way in which he did. He knew that no one would stand up to him or challenge him. That in itself is the culmination of years of social programming and a massive societal issue that is constantly making the news. Essentially, the power dynamics at play within the GBV pandemic. More pertinent than ever, especially seeing as we've just entered 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. As I close this episode, it's evident that the concept of seeing something and saying something is relevant now more than ever. You and your actions, no matter how small, could be life-changing to the existence of someone else. You could be saving a life. Chevonne's memory and her bright light will forever live on in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. She will never be just another number. Until next week, stay safe, stay blessed, and stay the amazing human beings that I know each and every single one of you are. Besides those of you who leave me hate comments. Bye!